So listening to two foreign speakers, to Sova and a few of the discussion points as well, thought that I might try to incorporate some ideas in text while we're fine. So as I mentioned, I recently defended my thesis, which is this volumes with the annex of translations, but the title is in French. The title is in French, but it's Formation of Another Philosophy of Being in the World in the Kyoto School, the first philosophy of Tanabe Hajime. And so what I focus on is Tanabe from 1910 until 1932. So I cut off my research basically before what's normally called Tanabe Tetsugaku, and so stay with the proto-Tanabe before he starts getting interested in something like a social ontology. So the things that he's most well known for, I have left. What I'm going to do here is to cut it down even further and stick to 1910s generally. I'll be talking about the question of consciousness in general in the early Tanabe Hajime. And we'll be focusing mainly on the influence of Heinrich Rickert in his thinking. But of course, this influence isn't only effective up until 1920, which is where I'll leave the question for now today. But it also has a significant impact on his reading of Heidegger and his critique of Heidegger. So I'm going to start reading, and I'll probably make some explanations along the way. So it's not Hachime's early work, spanning the 1910s to the 1920s. It is a constant theme that if we are to account for the transcendence of the object of knowledge, the individual consciousness cannot be an adequate point of departure. Enrico, did you get the text? I think I sent it to you.
No.
No. You haven't received it yet? I answered your Corona text with it. Sent items.
Now I received it. So in a couple of seconds, I can show the text to
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. So the concept of pure experience, which you find in Tanabe's maiden article, his first article from 1910, is precisely the concept that opens up a path for conceiving of a pre-individual consciousness, or what he will soon call the consciousness in general, taking up a Kantian term, Bewusstsein überhaupt, which he develops from the neo-Kantian Heinrich Rickert. On several occasions already, I have argued that Tanabe's concept of pure experience cannot be immediately identified with the Nishidi and such, despite parallels. I'll not go into depth with this question of inheritance here, but it should be noted at least that the knee-jerk reaction of reading Nishida, and especially a Buddhist conception into this concept, ought to be called into question, if nothing else than because the term can be found in other thinkers in Tanabe's immediate past, and he quotes. In the following, I'm going to synthesize in a much too brief form some of the analysis I've developed in detail at length in my doctoral dissertation, which, as I said, I defended last month. How should the concept of pure experience be understood? Its purity means, first and foremost, that this experience has not undergone any processing by an act of thinking. Thinking or judgment only come about on the basis of this pure experience, which in its purity must, on this account, be distinguished from experience. So pure experience and experience on the other. In fact, it is clear that pure experience in Tanabe means Erlebnis. It corresponds to Theodor Lips's understanding of this concept, meaning the immanence of consciousness where there is no distinction between an objective and a subjective side. In Erlebnis, the Erleben and das Erlebte are one. So we say the living through and that which is lived through, one. Distinguish, Erlebnis from experience, which I think is necessary. This Erlebnis is devoid of an object. The object is a Gegenstand, what stands opposed, and it only comes about through an act of positing or thetic judgment. But not only is there no distinction between the subject and the object, the maiden article concludes with the affirmation that there is here no distinction between the same and the other. The idea of pure experience can be contrasted with the concept of pure thinking in Hermann Cohen. In Cohen, pure thinking is understood as the origin from which experience develops. The given is understood as a task to be solved, much like a mathematical problem. This pure thinking is indeed not to be confounded with a psychological process taking place in an individual consciousness, but is, on the contrary, the advancement of the natural mathematic sciences, the crown jewel of which is physics. With us here, in much the same way as pure experience, have something like a consciousness in general, a thinking that, if it is to be understood as transcendental, cannot rely on an empirical consciousness. However, as we see in Tanabe's article from 1914, The Limits of Logicism in Theory of Knowledge, or in epistemology, if you will, Tanabe's idea is that if pure thinking is to advance incessantly, the task that propels it must be lived through in a certain sense. It must be given in a certain sense. And this is why, at a deeper level than pure thinking, independent of cessation, there must be a pure experience, independent of thinking, as its source. In pure experience, the task, Aufgabe, or the ought, the sollen, in Ricardian terms, must be lived through, erlebt. Now, in Ricard, who is also criticized in this text from 1914, in Ricard, fundamental insight is the impossibility of understanding knowledge in terms of representation. By the way, I write knowledge here, it's Ninski, which there's not much of a consensus in English how to translate this, erkenntnis, right? Knowledge or cognition. I've just gone with knowledge here, which could just as well have gone with cognition. So the impossibility of understanding knowledge or cognition in terms of representation. Knowledge is always an act of judgment, and judgment is the acknowledgement, Anerkennung, of an ought, a sollen, which precedes being. At a fundamental level, this sollen is the object of knowledge, and only through a judgment that attributes being does being come about. If the object were understood as given as a being, it would, according to Rickert, be impossible to overcome the framework of representation. So at this pre-judicative level of the ought, there is no being. Our starting point, where the ought is given, is therefore starting as a standpoint of nothingness. A nothing that is an indeterminate something in general. A meon. This something in general has the demand or the ought, the task to be determined, judged in a certain manner, rather than another. But the consciousness that judges before all determination and before all individuation is not itself an individual and psychological consciousness. You see, if it were, we would have then determined it and have placed it already under a higher consciousness, and it would already be empirical. Since the content of consciousness is only insofar as it is judged as being, and it wouldn't be if it weren't judged as being, this ultimate consciousness that judges is itself to be found at a deeper level than the content. It is therefore devoid of content. In short, it is void, empty, and transcendental to the precise extent that it is empty. This ultimate subject of knowledge is thus not the psychological consciousness, but the consciousness in general. However, Tanabe's objection to this Descartesian perspective runs along the same lines as what we can call his radicalization of Cohen, where we saw step from pure thinking to pure experience, which I translated as erlebnis. In Ricard, the fact that this judging consciousness in general is devoid of content also means that it is a mere principle. It is not lived through, that is, it is not in conscience. But the erlebnis is not something like the reflected content of consciousness. It is the pre-reflected presence of consciousness to itself, where there is no distinction between a subjective and an objective side. In other words, it is not because consciousness in general is a mere principle that it is void of content, but quite to the contrary, because it is the being conscious, we might say, of consciousness as such, that which most intimately constitutes consciousness as conscious. Before any act of thinking or judgment, where the ought is given as a task. This is why it's empty, not because it's a mere principle. Again, the idea of consciousness in general should thus be understood to be, in its true form, a pure experience, or, in the terms of the article from 1914, immediate experience. Now, of course, sometimes Chuksetskeke is translated as direct experience. I, for my part, prefer talking about immediate experience for a number of reasons. One of them being direct experience implies that there's a passage from the subject to the object. Directness, it does contain a certain directedness, you might say, at an object. And that's precisely what we don't have here, since we don't have a distinction between the two. Another reason is the influence of Bergson, which is felt already here in this 1914 article on the limits of logicism and theory of knowledge. Although Tanabe, just as I think Indiko said about Nishida before, that Tanabe himself is very modest about his grasp of Bergson's theory. I haven't integrated here so many ideas about Bergson, but we could of course get into that afterwards in the discussion. An important distinction between the Tanabean concept of consciousness in general and the Ricartian such is that while the Ricartian concept is that of adjudicative consciousness, and thus a concept where there is a subject-object distinction, Tanabe's is one of consciousness without such distinction, immediate consciousness, immediate experience. After 1914, the term of consciousness in general disappears from Tanabe's texts for a time, but the idea as such, the idea of a pre-individual consciousness remains present. The first texts where the concept is most explicitly reintroduced date from 1918, under the form of the so-called Great I, Daiga. The concept of Buddhist heritage appears in the following two texts, on the Kantian theory of freedom and the infinite world. The Buddhist sense of the term Daiga refers to the self which, awakened to its emptiness, is opposed to nothing, and which is permeated by the universe in its totality, the self in its suchness. The identification of this great I with consciousness in general in neo-Kantian philosophy can be found in the text The Infinite World, quoted just before, where Tanabe writes the following. You can read the Japanese and footnote. I'll just read it aloud in English. Just like God, when Leibniz's philosophy is the highest monad, is the unifying subject of all the eternal truths, the a priori, which in the perspective of critical philosophy can be considered as the principles of the constitution of the world, are all unified by the great I. If we take consciousness in general, which to Kant was the subject of consciousness, to be a reality, in the form of the Fichtian I, it will indeed be the unifying subject of all the a priori. And it is precisely this I, which is the supra-individual great I. In the Kantian theory of freedom from the same year, 1918, Tanabe writes that we are only free when, and I quote, as the noumenon of, and this is one type, right, which we saw before as substance. I translated this as the noumenon of the universe, we are one with the sky and the earth. We're going to be able to circle back to Sova's talk on this point, I think. So we're only free when, as the noumena of the universe, we are one with the sky and the earth. The emptiness of the consciousness in general that we find in Vikat's philosophy, and which is taken over in Tanabe's concept of immediate experience, thus here takes on the meaning of the self as the all-enveloping and pre-individual or supra-individual totality. Our self in its suchness, in its ultimate true being as emptiness, is, we could say, the world as such. And this all-enveloping self is the concrete form of the consciousness in general. The distinction from the Vikatian concept that we saw in the above is clear in the article from the same year, the meaning of Leibniz's philosophy. Again, we have the Japanese in the footnote. I'll just read the English. Taking the eye as an object and thinking it as an individual eye is something that must take place against the background of the general eye, understood as the unifying subject, which determined, which when I write it with a hyphen is because I want to distinguish it from kite, so the two must be distinguished in Tanabe's philosophy. Understood as the unifying subject, which determines this individual eye as the point of combination of the us. And there must thus also be a general eye behind this individual eye, one which cannot be determined. This eye can only be thought as something that first takes the eye as an object facing it, and which consequently again absorbs this eye in itself. The true general eye is not only like the eye of the lived experience, something that cannot by any means be objectified. It must also be this general eye which absorbs the objects in itself. As Vikat has shown, consciousness in general, the transcendental eye, which from the point of view of critical philosophy can be recognized as the subject, the constitution of the objective world, is a mere limit concept, but as an idea, it can be thought as this manner of general eye. End of quotation. As the general eye, or the great eye, consciousness in general is not only that which, as the condition of objectivation, withdraws from the scene of objectivation. It's not just this act, this ultimately judicative consciousness that it is in the first Vikat. By the way, just a second ago when I was discussing, very shortly, of course, Tanabe's critique of the two near-conscious streams in his article from 1914, his reference point in the Vikat is Vikat's The Object of Knowledge, or the Object of Cognition, from 1904. This is the second edition of this book, which I believe is already twice as long as his first edition. And the third edition from 1915, which I'll turn to in a second, is again twice as long as the second edition. So he's all the time developing his idea, his concept of the object of knowledge, and with it his conception of the of consciousness in general. But in this early 1904 conception of the consciousness in general is that which, I'll just remind this as I said it before, and maybe give one more detail to it, is the acknowledgement of an ought. And Vikat illustrates this as the answer to an unequivocal question, meaning a question that solicits either a yes or a no. So the judgment is always a question of taking a certain position with regard to this question, either confirm it or deny it, relating to the question. So as I was saying, as the general eye, or the great eye, the consciousness in general is not only that which, as the condition of objectivation, withdraws from the scene of objectivation. This was the meaning of consciousness in general in the second edition from 1904 of Vikat's main work, The Object of Knowledge, the Gegenstand der Erkenntnis. which was the point of reference of Tanabe's critique as formulated in 1904 in The Limits of Logicism, the Theory of Knowledge. But in the interim, Rickert has published a third edition of this book in 1915, about twice the length of the second edition. Here it responds to the critique formulated by his student Emile Lask, to whose memory the third edition is dedicated, and reworks as a consequence his conception of the consciousness in general. Tanabe, in these lines that we quoted a moment ago, on the one hand maintains his earlier conception of the consciousness in general as the pre-individual immediate experience, very explicitly termed Taigin Begijiga, the I, that is, that has the form of lived experience or Erlebnis. Let it be noted in passing, thus, that immediate experience or pure experience have by 1918 been replaced by the term Taigen, that is, Erlebnis, or explicitly, if there should be still any doubters as to the synonymity of pure experience and Erlebnis that I mentioned at the start. This level of development of consciousness in general is a stage of Ansicht, which, while the objectivated individual consciousness, or what Tanabe will soon call Injitsu, so the real or the actual consciousness, if you will, is the stage of Fürsicht, which comes about through reflection. And finally, reflection and determination. And finally, consciousness in general, which again absorbs all the objects, the I included, and thus synthesizes them, is the stage of An und für sich. An essential modification in Rickert's concept of the art under Lask's influence is that it is now understood, that is from 1915, as the belonging together of form and content, which proceeds from their original unity in the Erlebnis preceding knowledge. A central point in Tanabe's critique from 1914 is, as I tried to explain a moment ago, that there's no place for the Erlebnis in Rickert. But here in 1915, we see it quite clearly, a conception of Erlebnis that comes rather close to that of Tanabe himself, and the way that he takes over Erlebnis from Theodotus. I proceed. The Erlebnis, while lived through, falls outside the purview of theory of knowledge or epistemology, which is always dualistic. So it may be worthwhile quoting Rickert at length here. Again, we have the German in footnote for those who would be interested in the original. We know and thus become conscious of truth through judgment, by affirming the ought of the belonging together of form and content. We here have the unity of being and meaning in an immediate manner. Here we live through, erleben, we live through it. Yet, already by recognizing that it is us who have it and live through it, or that the subject seizes the object, we must break apart the immediately lived through unity. That is, we must split it into the real cognitional act of the subject and the unreal objectivity, and its unreal objectivity, dessen nicht wirkliche Gegenständigkeit. So that's the ought. We cannot say that the unity that we live through is, for that would be knowing it as a unity. There can be no such knowledge. Because is being, as I tried to explain before, relies on an act of judgment. What title, which already means, of course, original scission. The unity itself can never be theoretically thought by means of concepts. It can only be atheoretically lived through. For even by saying that we live through it, we break it apart. This split belongs to the essence of all theory. To that extent, all monism and all philosophy of identity, Identitätsphilosophie, lead theory of knowledge astray. Lead epistemology astray, if you will. If we wish to overcome this dualism, then we must entirely abandon theoretical contemplation science, and make our attempt through aesthetic contemplation in art or through mystical contemplation in religion, all while giving up hope of ever bringing what we intuit, das Geschaute, or what we live through in these domains to a logically exhaustively understandable expression. End of quotation. Quite a few points stand out in this passage, points which echo through Tanabe's texts and upon which we can only touch very briefly here. First, it should be clear that the idea of the original unity of Erlebnis is not absent from Riquet's thinking, but epistemology, Erkenntnistheorie, oversteps the mark of what is accessible from a rigorous scientific point of view and falls into religion or an aesthetic experience insofar as it tries to grasp this Erlebnis. It is from this original unity, the original Zusammen, that at the level of judgment, Urteil, and knowledge, where this unity is lost, a belonging together, that is, a Zusammengehören of form and content, derives. So it derives from this original Zusammen, which eludes the grasp, right, of theory, and therefore of theory of knowledge. And this Zusammengehören presents itself as not, as a Sollen. The ought is thus subjective in the sense that it is relative to a subject, demands a certain act of recognition, acknowledgement from the subject, and only arises as an ought through accession. The difficulty of dealing with this Erlebnis and the dangers of philosophy of falling into religion, a danger that prefigures Tanabe's later critique of Nishida, is clearly stated in Tanabe's text from 1918 on. His adaptation of the phenomenological reduction through the filter of Natop's psychology in the form of a subjectivizing reconstruction that leads the configurations of an objective world back to an original Erlebnis, Teichen, from which they proceed, is his earliest attempt, you might say, at forming a rigorous philosophical method capable of dealing with this fundamental stratus of consciousness. But what then about? So now we've looked at this, the Erlebnis, right? We had in Tanabe's earlier quote, first the idea of consciousness in general as Erlebnis, as a Teilchen riesiger, and then on the other hand, there is this consciousness that envelops everything. So what about consciousness in general in Riquet's revised epistemology from 1915 of Regionalis? Well, let us recall that in the second edition of The Object of Knowledge, or Cognition, from 1904, consciousness in general was understood as purely judicative consciousness, affirming or negating an unequivocal question, as the ways in which it could position itself with regard to an ought. But since the question implies the possibility of doubt and of error, it relates only to a finite consciousness, that is, to an individual consciousness. So far as consciousness in general is entirely transcendental, these empirical delimitations cannot apply to it. Consciousness in general is what Riquet calls ein fragloses Ja, a yes without a question. This opens up the path for giving an entirely new meaning to the concept of consciousness in general, which we find it in Tanabe in the late 1910s and the 20s. This is, of course, Iski Panitsirte. There's a text called Iski Panitsirte from 1919, and so on consciousness in general, and then another one is the problem of the subject of knowledge, the problem of the subject of cognition, if you will. And here he gets into the question more in depth of consciousness in general. So this opens up the path for an entirely new meaning of the concept of consciousness in general, right, in the late 1910s and the 20s. While consciousness in general had at first been the ultimate and unobjectifiable subjectivity, it now takes on the meaning of the total subsistence, Sonnenlitze, or Bestand, right? Sonnenlitze is the translation of Bestand, which is difficult to render into English. Sometimes standing reserve is understood as translated as that. I go with subsistence here. The total subsistence of meaning. Consciousness in general is no longer that which constitutes all content as object, but is, in a sense, more objective than all objects, as that which sets the stage or envelops all objectivity. And yet, at the same time, it is the ideal of the actual or individual consciousness, which strives for knowledge. In the concluding pages of Tanabe's first book from 1915, The Recent Natural Sciences, the Japanese thinker has spoken of man, as of the human being, as a realizer of ideals, and of this realization being the return to the universal self, overcoming one's small self, one's individual self. Inscribed in the very being of the individual consciousness is a striving towards the realization of ideals precisely because it comes about through a scission and expulsion from this totality of meaning and value, which as such becomes the ideal, is that which the individual consciousness is to be, if it is to be fully itself, if it is to regain, that is, its true being. If we are open to objects of knowledge, open to a world of being, this is because more fundamentally, we're open to this horizon of the totality which always eludes our grasp, withdrawing beyond all that is, and which yet is the most intimate foundation of our own existence. This all-encompassing consciousness in general, which Tanabe had also called heaven or earth, or the sky and the earth, and equated with the great I, is not a being, but what sets the stage for all being. In other words, this connection of heaven and earth, to which Soba alluded a few hours ago, is the realization of good, as the realization of good is indeed the realization of that which was first called transcendental apperception, that is, the consciousness in general, the suchness of the self and nothingness. And yeah, let me just add as a footnote to this, I said that after this, later in Tanabe's writings, this understanding of consciousness in general is this all-enveloping totality and untotalizable totality, we might say, because it can't be reduced to the being. From it is the key to understanding how he reverts the ontological schema of Heidegger's ontology, and tries to say that instead of understanding our relation to the world from an individual, from a Dasein that's individual to start with, you gotta say instead, Heidegger doesn't have anything like a consciousness in general. We need to reintroduce this consciousness in general. We need to reintroduce a totality, an all-enveloping totality, and say that the individual derives from this through determination, through delimitation, is the expulsion from this. That's how the individual is open to this horizon. So it has, we'd say, a prodigious career even after the end of the 1910s. But I didn't have time to go into that here. So yeah, thank you very much for your attention.
Soba, please, if you are the
Who's in
first, cannot
charge?
judge. So
Yeah, thank you very much, Morten. Yeah, I could see you mentioned that there might be some parallels, and now we can. Yeah, it's quite interesting to see the way that Tanabe is reacting in his own way then to its original idea of pure experience and immediate experience. And yeah, I think maybe the interesting thing to look at is it looks like from Tanabe at the time, he was interested in this problem of knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. And we see from Nishitani's side, he was more interested in the kind of, maybe not so much the meaning of knowledge question, but the meaning of life question, right? This endless erlebnis, I think, is the perfect way to put that problem. This, the meaning of the living through, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, one thing I was curious then, as far as the way that these issues of individual consciousness and consciousness in general, or the great I, I think how you trained it, is it Daiga?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, Nishitani also uses this term at that time, and I was wondering then, like, at this time, Nishitani was already interested in this problem of the particular, what would eventually, famously in Tanabe, be redeveloped as the species, so the middle between the universal and the individual. And so I'm curious, of course, that at this time in Tanabe, do we see something between the individual I and the great the great I? Right? Is there some kind of social? Is there any inkling yet of a social horizon, I guess you could say?
The social horizon that you find in the early texts, there are a few places where there is something of an idea of subjectivity, but it's in the sense that precisely this all-enveloping consciousness, right? It's that by diving into your own Erlebnis, right? That I mean into this fundamental finding, that's where subjectivity opens up. There's an Einfühlung, an empathy there. It's in his 1919 text on history, that you find stuff like that, and then in his text on the ontology of Confucianism, the fundamental is the social order. So there are a few places where you do see this idea of intersubjectivity, but the problem is that in the early text you don't see the other as another, but simply as a dimension of the self, you could say, because it's enveloped in this all-encompassing Daiga. And yet he always strives to understand something like a non-I. There has to be, from the very start, something that opposes will. You can see this already in 1910. This would be sensation. He then develops it already in 1920. He has the idea of the body as being the fundamental essence of sensation, the central one that binds all the others together. And it's in the body that we'll find, to start with, this opposition. There are other. It takes other forms as well. There are other avatars of this opposition to the self. There's this fundamentally irrational aspect there that always has to be present if we are to avoid falling into something like an immanent. How do you say emanation? It's the idea that everything emanates from the will or from the spirit. And in the
last critique,
and I think that very early on there's probably some less in Tanabe on this point. Of course, I believe it's in Rickert, though, that we have an idea of, say, I see this spot as blue and this spot as red, and this doesn't depend on me, and that's just contingent. It cannot, and that not only does it depend on me, but it's irrational in the sense that it cannot be derived from any principles, and so you always have to have this irrational contingency that just opposes us. Yeah.
Is this connected to that idea of, I think did you use the word expulsion, like the relationship between the great I and the individual I? It's a reduction of finitude or continuity.
You also in your talk alluded to the fact that there is no inner sense without a relation to the object, and then in 1918 Tanabe draws very clearly on this. And that's the idea that that's the thorough line that he tries to really pull out in different ways. But is grasping at it for a long time without finding a way.
Now that you mentioned, I think in the Shunaronri to Sekai Zushi, is that it? I think there too is about the interrelation of space and time and how you can't build with the interface.
That's the thing. Why the speciality, which first and foremost is constituted through the movement of the body is in 1920. That's the idea. You have this idea of the intuitive space that is fundamental for the constitution of objective space, right? And it has to be placed at the same level as intuitive time. So already in 1920, you have all the keys for his reworking of Kant's and Heidegger's reading of Kant, of course, schematism, right? Schematism of the world rather than the schematism of time, which then gives a certain priority to speciality and therefore to the body. Sorry, that was a long.
No, thank you. Actually, helps me connect some dots there.
Yeah, yes. If I could just.
A lot of this is unfamiliar to me, so big question to ask was really naive, but let me begin with a specific one. And that's the relationship between Tanabe's, the purity of Tanabe's consciousness in general, and his attraction to the neo-Kantians, to Rickard, to Lassen, and maybe less to Wittgenstein, particularly that school.
Yeah.
The one thing that the neo-Kantians kept from Kant was that the idea that there is no pure consciousness. The consciousness is formed by a priori transcendentalism. What Rickard added to it was the fact that the culture can provide this transcendental formation, this pre-forming consciousness, much the same way that time, space, and causality did for Kant. Okay? And in Last, it was value. But he referred to it as transcendental values. You talked about the red and the blue, but he talks about this irrational hiatus, which is somehow or other transcendental value always comes in. So the question to go back again is this consciousness pure? And in what sense is it pure? Is it free of all formation? And if it's free of all formation, then talk of value or Zolan or any transcendental is completely out of place.
Right. Okay. So the 1914, 1904 edition of Rickard's Object of Knowledge. The relation is to the ought. There is not really much of a distinction there, and a question of value in this. It's only after, as you point out, after Lask's influence that Rickard really incorporates the idea of a value that he distinguishes more clearly from the Zonen, because the Zonen remains subjective, remains relative to a subject, whereas the value is objective in a certain sense. But the way that I understand it, to this value is a non-oppositional objective realm, and this is where Tanabe then finds this, which Tanabe reformulates basically as the consciousness in general.
So the consciousness in general is preformed in some sense.
Right, it's the
priori trend, so it's not pure.
I don't understand how it's not pure.
Well, if consciousness is preformed, I mean, Kant would never go along with the idea of
but it's not formed. It's the totality of meaning and of value. It's the setting of all meaning and value.
Meaning and value in abstract. There's no a priori transcendental. There's no a priori formation. So, for example, my sight is dependent upon my eyes, which determine what I can see and what I can't. Kant thought that the mind was like that. There are certain things you simply can't think because you can't think outside of these transcendental a priori. And the neo-Kantians came along and said, yeah, but maybe still the more important about the other cultural ones, they're shifting, changing, but you can't be without them. Now, that's an abstract statement, of course. There's a value always comes into the picture. I'm talking about specific value. In other words, if you say there's always value, I suppose you could speak of a purity. But if you talk of actual birth and origin of knowledge, then you're talking about concrete, specific, informed channels through which the mind works, and that's the purity concept.
I'm not sure I quite follow. There would be the absolute values of good, beauty, and,
I mean, this was the problem, I think, with especially with Rickert, is that he didn't know where to look for the patterns through which our minds think. He didn't know where to look for the eyes, the eyeballs with which we have sight.
Right.
This was a serious great achievement, is that he actually knew where to look for them. And I think that Tanabe really found a similar idea when he began to talk about the notion of specific. We can't think without thinking historically. And the ability to see through that begins from recognizing what these a priori given are.
Okay.
And then to transcend them.
No, I
So
understand you
my
better.
question goes back to the idea of purity. And I think what would help is when we get into these cultural forms, then you jump into Kasira, because there's all sorts of concrete examples. His work on symbol and myth and so on. That's really wonderful. It really shows you the story, kind of story you're in, the framework in which your mind works, even so that the mind is not a tabula rasa at all. Okay, but it's hard to find. I was trying to think of one as I was listening to you. A concrete example of how Tanabe's model structuring the emergence of knowledge.
Yeah.
How that's different from plants or babes, solids or crystals or genes. I don't mean in the abstract. I mean a concrete example of actual knowledge taking place. You say Tanabe would look at that happening this way, and Husserl might look at it happening this way. And if you can apply it to concrete examples, then you have a critical tool. See what difference it makes for using one model rather than another in order to know what's true knowledge from what's false knowledge. And if all of these structures don't help at all to distinguish true from false knowledge, then it doesn't make any difference. But again, the difficult but very naive question is, we need a concrete example
Nice.
of how this works, how it works differently, and how it shines or illuminates the truth better than, say, another model.
I'd say that much like Itachi-san's intervention before, Tanabe, very much like Shida, tries to open up a path for a new metaphysics, right? To set the stage for a metaphysics that goes beyond begets or founds begets framework there. In terms of, I don't know if I'm probably not answering you directly. I don't see how I question of giving a concrete example of how knowledge comes about. Well,
I mean, like in Bergson, we have this idea of is the distinction between intuition and intellect. And he talks about it as knowledge by acquaintance, as opposed to knowledge by description. And knowledge by acquaintance, he says, is the basis of metaphysics. Knowledge by description is the basis for practical action. So he talks about works of art and all sorts of other things as with ways of understanding how the mind comes to knowledge, how it gets sidetracked, how it gets confused. He and William James is in the same pattern, follows the same language, and Bertrand Russell picked it up. That's what I find missing here.
Oh, okay, I see. Okay, all right. So if I want to be a little bit concrete, maybe it doesn't go exactly into the framework that you're looking for, but I'll say that the essential thing, as I see it here, is that it accounts for our openness to the world as such. It accounts for maybe not knowledge in the terms of a judgment, but rather in terms of perception. In the sense that it gives it instead of saying that, well, the individualities are given first and foremost. You have a given framework first, and given as something that is in a certain sense lacking, and this lack is described in the being of the individual consciousness, which accounts for why we're always open to a horizon. Whenever we see, say, a box here on the table, I see it as something that has more. That has more sides to it. It's inscribed in a totality of the world, and the totality of the world is always open to us. And if you were to start from saying we have the individual objects, how do we add them up to something like the infinite totality of the world? And that's this is a central idea. I think it's Tanabe start with from 1916, especially from his on the universal, or you will. He himself says, I don't want to say universal with this, I want to say general. But if we call it the universal, the idea that if you are to take an empirical approach to the question of knowledge, you're never going to achieve the universality that is always necessary for knowledge to come about. There has to be a pre-given universality in a certain sense. And so we start rather with the most universal that there is. And as I see it, the way that he works this out goes more and more in the direction of an account of our openness to the world, in which we're open basically to a horizon that is not presently given. But within this, in a certain sense, absent horizon, which is given as absent, there are things that come to the fore to us. So that's how I understand it. But I'm of course approaching this in a very phenomenological manner that might have a certain aspect of creativity to it. That's how I understand.
Logical, would you say that the pure consciousness of Tanabe would agree with Husserl's principle that all consciousness is consciousness of something?
Right. So that would have to say also that the pure consciousness in general already has an object, and that's not the case. It's just what envelops everything. But then within that, when all the consciousnesses that are individual, right? All the genjitsu that comes about through this determination is always intentional. Yes. Okay. But to start with, already on aesthetic judgment, what Tanabe is doing there is that he's reworking Lips's concept of Leibniz, which in turn is a way of taking over Brentano's inexistence of the object, the intentional inexistence of the object. That's the question of how then instead of taking over the realist perspective that is still Brentano's, where the things are. That's really the problem there. Somebody like Lipso will say, no, it's a demand It's a demand that we acknowledge. Pika then says, oh, but to Lips, this demand still derives from an object. So we can't say that there's an object. We have to rather say, no, the demand, which he calls the Sollen, is the object. It doesn't rely on something that is. No, we constitute it through this Sollen. And so, as I understand it, from the start, Tanabe's point of departure, what he's trying to do is to rework this intentionality, the Brentanian and intentionality through Lips, through Pika, by purifying it from all this dogmatic realist baggage that it has, and then it takes, of course, its own course, right? Yeah. Also, it's interesting though the question of history that you bring up, but I think that would take us far afield. Maybe there are other questions.
I'd like just to pick up on this. Does Tanabe ever go towards Natwerp? And I'm thinking of Natwerp's methodology of the reconstructive method. So I'm just quoting Kassir, since I don't have Natwerp in front of me. We can never expose the immediate life and being of consciousness as such. This is Kassir. So his problem is that you can't ever get to it. All you have is the product. But it is a significant task to seek a new aspect and meaning for the unhalting process of objectification by exploring it in a twofold direction.
Yeah.
So the methodology is always going to be bidirectional,
yeah.
Two-directional. From the terminus ad quo to the terminus ad quem, and then back again. So from the terminus ad quem to the terminus ad quo. So from the positing act and to its product, from the product back to its positing act. And so you can never, to speak about the idea of entering into immediate life, or the immediate life and being of consciousness, is itself a precondition for understanding. It's one of the frameworks of understanding the product. But the product is a preconditioned understanding of understanding consciousness. And so it is only in the continuous back and forth between these two directions of method that the object of psychology, but of course this is Natwerp's greater psychology, so it's not pure empirical psychology, can be made visible as such. And so it requires an active imagination.
Right.
Does Tanabe ever go this direction?
Nothing.
Because this would solve.
Yeah.
If I'm understanding the question and the problem, it sounds like, this infinite loop. I want to get to A, but I can't get, all I have is B, but I have to understand B in terms of A, and it just seems to be going around. And it seems to me that Natwerp's general psychology, his reconstructive method of his general psychology,
right.
Which Kassir adopts in the way he approaches cultural structures, would have been a useful tool.
And it is. So, if are you?
So I'm asking,
Yeah.
does this
Sure.
Natwerp, is this obviously goes this direction?
Yeah.
Does Tanabe ever take up Natwerp's idea of the reconstructive method, which of course would bring him very close to the very edge of neo-Kantianism?
Yeah.
I mean, and this is my issue with neo-Kantianism as a category, is that we talk about early neo-Kantianism or the scientism of Cohen or Rickard's logicism, and go, there is it, that's neo-Kantianism. But you've got these characters like Lask, Natwerp, Kassir, who are pushing the envelope, if you will. They're at the very border of what can be called classical neo-Kantianism, and yet they're taking the transcendental method into spheres that would normally be excluded for transcendental philosophy, and saying, no, you still have to bring this method into these domains, the domains of pure experience or immediate or direct experience, or non-immediated experience, etc. So I'm just curious whether he did this.
Yeah, two points to the answer. One thing is, 1913, he has a text that's called the meaning of description in science relating to, or knowledge relating to the physical sciences, or something like that. And there he does spend some time on Natop. Here the question is that to Natop, well, the question is about description, right? And so to Natop here, Natop tries to explain how the description means the same thing as construction. That he gives the example that ein Cirkel zu beschreiben, or to describe a circle is to construct a circle. That's how the description should be understood here, because what the natural the constitution of the natural world, that is the object of the sciences. The point of departure for it is this pure thinking of Cohen at this time in his work. Although he works Cohen a little bit, but then Tanabe comes in and says, no, it's not from the point of view of thinking. Something is given before that, so it's not construction; it's reconstruction. Description has to be a reconstruction because this actually already given as a task. First point. Second point, and this is more to directly to the question of the methodology. From well, you see the first influence of the idea of Natop's general psychology at the end of a text from 1915 that's called something like, how's it? The natural sciences versus the science of the yeah, well, it's station. Well, it's not plural because it's Japanese. So, right. But in any case, the here he finishes on the note of the possibility of returning in a reconstructive manner to the original typing with Natop's theory. And after that, he will keep pushing this point. He'll start calling it transcendental psychology, drawing now on Wickert. So he takes from Wickert the term of transcendental psychology, but the method that he tries to explain is Natop's. He quite explicitly talks about reconstructive subjectivation, or subjectivizing reconstruction of the Genbaiking, right? The primordial alienness, if you will, which and the reconstructive idea is that we're already thrown into an objective world. It's always through this objective filter that we can go back.
So now we come to the debate between Kafir and Heidegger.
Yeah.
Heidegger is going to complain that in Kafir and in anyone following this reconstructive method is the subject searching constantly for its own unity and never being able to get there.
Yeah.
And then it goes back to the critique that Fichte has of Kant. If you don't have the unity of apperception, your system doesn't work. Therefore, there must be something called intellectual intuition. And so, while all seeing goes through the sight of spirit, so it's always mediated seeing, and therefore it's always caught up in this chasing for its unity. In Kassir, or anyone following that method, Heidegger is going to say, posit the seeing of Dasein. The problem then, of course, becomes it just reiterates the gap between the unity of seeing or the non-mediated, I prefer non-mediated experience of being, light, whatever word you want, to the mediated awareness. And so this comes right to the problem of Nishida. He wants to talk about pure experience, this side of the equation, but then he's got to talk about it, he's got to have the experience of pure experience. And then we're right back to a circle. So are we getting out of the circle, or are we just finding new ways to talk about the circle?
Well, I think that this is precisely his problem, Tanabe, that he's trying to, this is where he distinguishes himself already from 1917 from Nishida, because he's trying to give a rigorous methodological framework for talking about what Nishida first calls pure experience, and then the concept develops to be able to say, okay, we can still use concepts to talk about this in a reconstructive manner. And then Heidegger, of course, when he comes back from Germany, you can see that the hermeneutical phenomenology of life has given him a new approach to this, and he will have more or less left behind the Networkian conception of the evocative, because really that's what it is.
Sure, he goes over to the dark
side. He goes over to the dark side. Yeah. Yes.
Can I ask one last question, Enrico?
Yeah, if you are prepared to finish around 6, yes.
Okay. So, Erlebnis and Erleben. I mean, there's a couple of translations that Erkenntnis, I would always go with cognition, because knowledge is Wissen, and Kant's talking about different modes of cognition, and knowledge is only one mode of cognition.
Okay.
So that's why I always go with cognition. Erleben, you translate it as live through.
Yeah.
And so you got a sentence, live through it.
Yeah.
And the second you say that, I think, well, I'm living through something as opposed to living it.
Right. Yeah.
And I looked at the German when we scrolled by it, and I was like, I was not through that. It's just living
It's
it.
not further, so yeah.
So by translating it, living through it, do you not introduce a fracture that would be intellectually hostile to the very idea of Erleben, the idea of living it, as opposed to living through it? There
Might
seems
be
to be a
better.
subtle difference there,
Might be.
and I'm just curious whether that's a problem.
Yeah. No, I think it's a good suggestion. Yeah. It's I'd have to give that some thought and try to put it into practice.
And you use the word irrational a lot, and this is often this is the way it's always talked about. It's irrational.
Right there, they're going to take over, of course, the vocabulary from the thinkers that I'm talking about here.
But and the translations into English as irrational are so I'm not going to justify. That's not my problem. I'm curious whether we should give up the word irrational and sort of speak about non-rational. The sensibilities are irrational, and you read that, and you go, you think of sensibility going, it's like it's not being rational. I mean, sensibility is Trump. I mean, that's irrational. But it's non-rational.
Yeah,
is sure. And I'm curious whether there's any textual ability to do that in the Japanese. In the German, no. But I'm curious whether in the Japanese, what is negating the rational, what's standing for the ear, is it really just a non-rational, or can we push that Japanese translation?
The Japanese does that all the time. Yeah. I mean, that's the reason for the character he.
Yeah.
So opposed to food, the other key of letting he is saying. So like in Dogen, he talks about not knowing. but it really means without knowing,
Non-knowing.
a knowing.
Right.
You also have Han in Japanese, like Han or Han say some kind of sound.
Yes, we say
Like
like
opposite. Like
But in the there's also a question of what extent the Japanese thinker is echoing, for example, in this case, German philosophers, and where I'd rather, if it doesn't introduce some kind of how should I say treason against the Japanese thinker, show how his vocabulary takes over the original instead of writing as if I didn't know the
I was
original.
just curious whether there was some room for moving in a different direction so that sensibility didn't
Sure.
seem like it was just insane.
No,
Like, who ever thought that?
yeah.
But something that stands literally, it's something that is not, it's outside of reason.
Yes.
Because in Hegel, sorry, the bad Hegel,
My ears.
even though this is a quote from Hegel, Hegel says in the phenomenology of spirit, it's a quote.
Which paragraph?
I can look it up if you like. When reason speaks of another, in fact, it only speaks of itself.
Yeah.
And so within Hegel, there can be no non-rational encounter. Only that which is rational or conceivable exists. This is again another quote.
Feels sick.
Yeah, I know. But so there can be nothing outside of reason. There's no sense to talk about it. Whereas here, there's a definite quest to have something, an encounter with something that stands at the border, at the very least. The encounter of the border.
Yeah.
Because you can't encounter the thing, but the encounter of the border, if I understand. And so this is what Tanabe is theorizing about. Is that fundamentally everything originates from the encounter of this border.
Right. That's
Which you call sensibility,
the determination, and the
And
limitation.
necessarily an avatar.
Yeah.
You had a bunch of avatars. I like that. But it really is the encounter of the border or the limit.
Yeah.
That throws us back on ourselves. And we can never articulate this border.
Mm.
So it's an experience of which we're constantly speaking, but can never articulate, which is the answer to Kant.
Mm.
Kant says you cannot talk about that which you cannot experience. And what they're saying is, yes, but there's an experience of which we cannot talk about that determines talking, judgment. Is this the basic, what Tanabe is trying to say? I mean, it's,
I didn't feel like anything that you said was very shocking in regards to I felt like you were going into the same direction as I understand.
so good.
So-
Maybe I understand something fun,
Yeah,
even though it's not the better Hegel.
Yeah, I'm restraining myself, but
It's a
if I understand you correctly, then you apparently also understand me correctly.
Let's keep with that.
It all hinges on whether I understand things.
Let's
You never
grasp
know.
the illusion of understanding. And
That's-
Enrico, are we out of time now? We should call it. And thank
Maybe we could move to the next.
Okay.
Okay, guys.